Hey there, Jon Chorba here from ReallyEasyGuitarLessons.com, and in this video I'm doing an Ask Me Anything on some of the questions that one of my students has asked me. So Jack is one of my students. He is getting into home recording and doing some songwriting at home. And he is new to home recording. He doesn't really know, what to do. And I have a lot of experience in recording. I've been doing it since I'm 16 years old in bedrooms, basements, and studio areas of every house I've ever lived in. I have a background and a degree in audio engineering. I worked as an audio engineer for a little bit. And I've, produced and, done my own recordings of myself and some of the bands I've been in and whatnot. So I know a lot about this stuff. And, while this channel is primarily geared towards, guitar lessons, inevitably guitar players kind of get into home recording these days because it's, the equipment is so cheap to buy. It's readily available on phones and tablets and all laptops have some sort of, recording software into it. And so it's something that everybody kind of gets into eventually, but it's also very confusing. And there's a lot that goes on into, creating a recording that sounds somewhat professional. Sounds like that it was, done in a studio. So, Jack has some questions for me. So I figured I would just go through these questions, create a little video on it because I feel like some of these are questions that get asked frequently. So I'm going to go through his questions here. But if you have any questions on home recording or recording in general, leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to do a future video where I answer your questions. So let's jump into Jack's. Jack has 9 questions for me, and I'm kind of just answering these all off the cuff. And so there's a good chance that I might just start rambling on and on and on and on. And so if there's anything that I say that is confusing or doesn't make sense, again, hit me up in the comments below, yell at me, and tell me, hey, clarify that, you dum-dum. So number 1 is, what order should I add the instruments? And what he's talking about is what process should you take to record instruments? Which one should you do first? Should you do drums first? Should you do vocals first? Should you do your guitar first? And the answer is, there is no answer. There's no one way to do anything when it comes to recording, mixing, and producing music. You can literally do whatever you want. But everybody kind of has their own way that they like to work, and they like to record, and they like to do stuff. And so for me, usually the way I like to put things together is I definitely like to have the drums first. Well, actually, back up a second. So it depends on what I'm working on. If I'm writing a song and I'm gonna try to release it on Spotify and like make it as pro sounding as I possibly can, before I even get to like recording stuff for real, there's a whole bunch of pre-production that I do. So like I'm always, it's kind of like I separate the writing aspect from producing music and the recording aspect of producing music. I like to, when I write, I experiment with different sounds and, I'll chop things up and edit things up, and it might not sound, great by itself, but it just gives me a reference point for things to think about so that when it's time to produce something for real, like I could just jump in and just start recording. But once I get to that point of, okay, I'm gonna record something, I like to start with the drums first. I like to kind of build my whole song around what the drums sound like, because all the records that I love have great drum sounds, and the drums are like such a dominant, soundscape of what you're hearing. And so I like to start with the drums first, and then after that I'll do like rhythm guitars. So I'm picturing here like it's some sort of rock song, even if it's like a rock ballad or there's different types of instruments in it. If it's got drums and guitars in it, typically I start with the drums first, and then I add rhythm-based guitars after that. And then the third step, I would add bass. And then the fourth, I would add keys or other instruments. So I don't really play keyboards or, organ or anything like that. If I need a piano part, I usually hire somebody out for it. But I have I have some tools. I have like easy keys, and I have some, some virtual instruments that I could, write in my own parts. And so after I have like the bare rhythm tracks, the drums, the bass, rhythm guitars, and any kind of keys or strings or anything that's, very important to the overall rhythmic sound of what it is I'm working on. After that, then I'll do my vocals. I'll do lead vocals first, and then I'll do some background vocals. And the last thing I like to do is any types of leads or guitar solos. And the reason why is because I like to have the vocals in there and kind of see what was done vocally before I start doing any type of lead guitar stuff, because I like to play off the vocal when I compose stuff like that. All right, and his second question is, do you record vocals last? So I kind of just answered that with that one. It's not the last thing I do, but it's usually in the later stages of recording. Because for me, singing, I'm not the world's greatest singer, but I sing on my stuff, and for me, the way I like to work and the way I like to record stuff, I like to have close to a finished product of what I'm singing on before I do it. If I feel like if I start with the vocals and I'm starting to build instruments around it, I feel like the sound of those other instruments might affect how I would sing over stuff. And so I like to save that for last. And it's kind of the same reason why I save my guitar solos for last, because I might do something vocally that's like, oh, that little melody thing that I did on the chorus, I could take that idea and make a little guitar lick out of it, and it could be a part of the solo. So that's kind of my strategy with how I like to, organize and the order I like to record things in. All right, his third question is, what is the basic process of mastering and how do I do it? So it's a weird question to ask because I feel like he's uncertain about the terminology of what mastering is. So first, let me just explain what the different stages of production are and kind of give you a broad overview of what those terms mean. So first is the tracking process. Tracking is when you are actually recording. You got your guitar on, you got your headphones on, you're printing your sound to disc, okay? Whether that's guitar, drums, bass, vocals, whatever. That is what I would refer to as the tracking process. And then after you track, I like to edit, right? So editing is just simply cleaning stuff up. Perfect example, when I do guitar solos, I often like to just improvise 4 or 5 takes of a guitar solo. So I just hit record and I just play whatever the heck comes to mind. And then I like to sometimes go through those different versions and edit them together, because sometimes it's like how I started the solo in take 1 is really, really cool, but like the middle section of take 3 is way better than the other sections. And so I'll kind of edit those little takes together to create a solo that I didn't perform from front to back, but it has the elements of playing off the cuff, and it just kind of ends up sounding a little more composed. So oftentimes I'll do that, and then I'll sit down and relearn the comped version and just record that. But I do a lot of editing, don't be ashamed with, if you feel like you're editing that you're doing something incorrectly, that you have to play everything perfectly and you can't edit anything later. Editing sometimes is just cleaning up little things. It's like, getting rid of string noise at the beginning of a take, or, just amp hiss, or like with vocals, I edit vocals heavily just because, again, I'm not that great of a singer. So to make myself sound better than I actually am, I do the same thing I do with solos. I'll do a bunch of takes and I'll just cut out different lines from those different takes to create one perfect take. And then there's the mixing process, and that is where you take the individual tracks that you recorded. So, if you record a drum set, every microphone on the drums ends up being a track inside of your recording software. When you record guitar, that's one track. And if you do more than one guitar part, and the bass track and the keys, all of the individual elements of your song, you take all of those individual tracks and you are summing them down into a 2-channel stereo file, okay? And that is the process of mixing. So I'm not sure if he was asking about mixing or if he's asking about the next process, which is called mastering. And mastering is where you take that 2-channel stereo file that you took all of the individual elements and you made like a soup, and you've got this 2-channel stereo file. Well, what you'll find is if you compare that 2-channel stereo file to things that have been commercially released, if you compare it to a CD or anything on Spotify or Apple Music, you're going to notice that it's a lot quieter, and the EQ is probably going to be off. Well, if you're new at recording, it's probably just going to sound really bad, and commercial stuff is going to sound really good. But I'm not talking about that. You will notice a clear difference in volume between something that's been commercially released and something that you've mixed for the first time on your laptop. And so the process of mastering is to take your finished stereo file and bring the volume and equalization up so that it's comparable to things that have been commercially released. And so the basic process of mastering is really just that, is you take your finished file and you literally compare it to things that are similar, right? So the last song that I produced was called Constant, and a couple of songs that I used as reference mixes were Fix You by Coldplay, Invincible by Eddie Vedder, and I think Like a Stone by Audioslave. And so when I was mastering my finished product, I was comparing the volume and the equalization to those tracks. And essentially, I'm going to use some processing. I'm going to use some limiting. I'm going to use some multi-band compression. These are all types of plugins that you can find inside of your DAW. And I'm just going through a little process to bring up the overall level of the song and adjust the equalization so it's comparable to things that have been commercially released. Now, question number 4, what are some things that you wish you knew that would have saved you hours of frustration / trouble if you just knew them to begin with? I could probably do several videos on all of the things that frustrated me, confused me, and gave me trouble. But I'll hit the big ones. Number 1 is get it right at the source. There's a great YouTube channel, Joe Gilder, I believe his name is. He does a lot of great home recording stuff. He preaches this concept of get it right at the source all the time. I didn't learn this from him, but he succincts it, he packages it in a way that is really, really perfect. The idea of getting right at the source is this. When I first learned producing and mixing and all this stuff, I was really under the impression that the magic happened with the mixing, right? The mixer sits down, he takes all those individual tracks, and he, through science and art, right, a little bit of both, creates the end sonic soundscape that sounds magical. Now, he does have a big hand in doing that. However, the sound of a kick drum, right, or the sound of a vocal, or the sound of a guitar, if it sounds like garbage when you recorded it, right, it's probably going to sound like garbage when you mix it, okay? So if you spend more time getting your tones right and getting your performance right when you record it, one, it makes your life a whole of a lot easier when you go to mix it. But more over than that, it's like that's where the magic really, really happens. It comes from the tones you choose up front when you record, and it comes from how you play it. Because that's one of the things that I really discovered from recording at home is like, my God, why does my guitar playing sound terrible? Well, it's because I was a terrible guitar player, right? It's because I was playing things that are ridiculously out of time with a lot of string noise, right? And it's all messy and sloppy, and that doesn't sound good. What sounds good is when things are working really tight together, right? And that you're only hearing what you want to hear, and what you don't want to hear is getting left on the cutting room floor, okay? So much of great sounding recording comes from you got to have decent enough chops so that when you play, it sounds good, right? And choosing the right tones and getting your performances to be tighter is a big, big part of it. But another big thing that is, I could get on a soapbox here and talk about this for a long time. Tempo fluctuation. Tempo fluctuation is such a big part about like the music that I love and the music that I write. Because, again, the bands and stuff that I love, Metallica, Pearl Jam, Guns N' Roses, Alice in Chains, stuff from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. When that music was produced, right, so much of it, it's one of the reasons why I love it is it's super authentic. And a big reason why it sounds the way it sounds is because those guys just got in a room and just played, right? They're just performing. And nowadays with modern music production, everything is recorded to a click track and everything is snapped to a grid. Now, I'm not knocking click tracks and I'm not knocking snapping to a grid. I think there is a purpose for all of that stuff. And especially the type of music matters. If like you produce electronic type music or even like, some of the more aggressive styles of metal, so much of that needs to be kind of robotic and super tight. And so having one tempo for the entire piece of music is completely acceptable and really expected for specific genres of music. But if you play rock music and you play the blues and you play, soulful country or whatever, right? If it's got that old-time rock and roll soul to it, tempo fluctuation has to be a part of it. And this eluded me for a long time because when I was getting really into recording and doing my first album, I recorded everything to a click. And I would listen to it back and I'd be like, why does this not sound right? It's just, there's the way I play it and then I record it and it just doesn't have the same kind of energy. And a lot of times it's because the riffs that you play, right, and song structures, like with certain aspects and areas of a song, they should speed up a little bit or slow down a little bit. I'm not talking about being off time and drastically off time, but again, the music that I love, it's not the same tempo from the beginning of the song to the end of the song, right? Every quarter note is not evenly spaced precisely for 3.5 to 7 minutes, okay? It doesn't work that way. You can't, nobody plays with that level of precision. There's always a little bit of swing. And to me, that little bit of swing adds a sonic fingerprint to what it is you're doing. The reason why Rage Against the Machine is a perfect example of this, because I've heard Tom Morello talk about it, like where their sound comes from is essentially the placement of like where the kick is hitting, where the bass is hitting, and where the guitar is hitting, right? They're all in time, but they're not all hitting at the exact same time. One might be a little bit before it, one might be a little bit, behind it, okay? And the combination of those three guys playing the way they play at the same time is what gives Rage Against the Machine, or Audioslave for that matter, that there's just a sound to it that you can't recreate unless you have those three guys playing at the exact same time together. And so one of the things that I've learned to kind of get around that is instead of recording to a click track and snapping everything to the grid, what I like to do is I record a performance, and I'll do several different scratch takes of sometimes just playing a rhythm guitar part, or even just strumming on an acoustic guitar. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a tempo map of what the song is supposed to feel like, okay? And then once I create a tempo map, I then snap things to that performance. So the way I like to look at it is instead of having a grid be 120 beats per minute for the entire performance and then snapping everything to that grid, what I do is I create a tempo map where the tempos fluctuate. Sometimes it's 120.7 and sometimes it's 119.4 and sometimes it's 117.6, right? I'm not trying to make it be mathematically, accurate or anything like that. I'm just playing it, and whatever it happens to be, it happens to be. And then I create a grid based off of that, and I snap to that grid. Question number 5, what's the best way to record guitar? Into my audio interface or by utilizing the amp sims in Logic? My Katana has its own amp sim interface on my Mac. Okay, so I think the best sound quality for recording guitar would be if you had, a great sounding amp and cabinet and you mic it and you record it through great preamps. That's the best sound you're gonna get because it's, it's the most analog and, the most real sounding. But I love amp simulation. I've been using digital technology for over 20 years now at this point, and it's come a long way. And amp simulations in 2024, they're so good. They're so close to being exact and real that most people can never tell the difference between an amp sim and a real amp, right? The layman, at least. Professional musicians and guys that have been around, great quality amps and have played them, they could probably tell the difference, but your average person off the street would never be able to tell. They just sound really, really good, and they're really easy to use. So in this situation, I'm a little bit familiar with the Boss Katana, but I've never owned one and I haven't recorded with one. So I don't know. When you're looking at audio interfaces, the quality of the analog to digital conversion is the component that you want to pay the most attention to. So if your Boss Katana doesn't have good analog to digital conversion, maybe upgrade to a different audio interface that has better conversion. But if it's fine on its own, if you're asking me what is better, the Boss Katana simulations or the simulations that are found in Logic, I really can't answer that because I'm not that familiar with them. The amp sims that I like the most, I think the best sounding ones are made by Positive Grid. They have a plugin called Bias Effects 2, and they also make the Spark amplifier. To my ear, those are some of the best digital recreations that I've experienced. I've used them all. I've used Kemper's and Axe Effects. I've used the Line 6 Pod. I've used the Helix. The Helix sounds really, really good. It's just expensive and has a lot of bells and whistles that you don't need with. But overall, the way I record, I plug my guitar directly into my audio interface, and then I use Bias Effects 2 inside of my Pro Tools system to get all of my amp sounds. Number 6, what the frank is a bus? So I got to go over to Pro Tools here to show you what a bus is, because there's no way I can explain it without kind of demonstrating it. Long story short, a bus is just simply a digital routing system. It's a way to get signal from point A to point B. And let me show you a couple of different ways that I use buses. So let's say I'm recording drums, okay? And like I was saying before, each individual element of the drum track is on, or of the drum performance is on an individual track. So right here, like I would have a kick track, a snare track, the first tom, the second tom, the third tom, floor tom, right? These could be all the individual elements of a drum track. And so that means if, when I'm mixing, right, like I'm going to move the kick drum to a certain level and the snare drum to a certain level, and then I'm going to pan my toms a certain way, right? And so each one of those individual elements is its own thing. But I also like to have control over the entire drum performance. Like, say, for instance, if I want to drop the drums out, right? There's an area of the song where I want the drums to be completely killed, and I don't want no sound coming out of them. Well, in order to do that, if I didn't use buses, I would have to go through each of the channels and turn them off and on at that specific point in time. Or just like sometimes it's useful to do processing on the entire drum kit. You could add compression and EQ to the entire drum performance versus the individual tracks. And so you would use a bus in order to route that signal. So the way I would do it is here's my kick track and here's my snare track and all that stuff. And here under the I/O, this is my input. So that's what my input was set to. And this is my output. And you'll notice that all of these outputs, I'm routing it to a thing that I call the drum bus. And if I come down here, here's my drum bus track that now has the input set to drum bus. So all of these individual channels, instead of them going to my main output, I'm sending them to a drum bus. And then the input of the drum bus is drum bus. And the output of the drum bus is what I call my 2 mix. And so for me, my 2 mix is this channel right here, which this is like my master bus almost, right? So like I take all of the individual elements or all of the group bus channels that I've created, right? Acoustic bus, electric guitar bus, whatever. And I route them all down into one channel that is called 2 mix. And then this is my main output, okay? So that when it's time for me to bounce something down, one thing I never do, and I don't think you should do either, right? I never come up to like file, or I don't even know where it is in Pro Tools, file bounce mix, right? And every DAW has something that functions similarly. It's like you have your finished product and you just bounce it down via the menu. I never do that for 2 reasons. One, you can't listen to what you're mixing as you're doing it. And I want to make sure that all of the moves that I made and all the sounds that I want to be there are in fact there, right? So I like to do real-time monitoring of my mix as I do it. So how I do that is I take the output of my 2 mix. I'm not going to do this because I'm going to lose my microphone, but I change the output of it to a bounce bus. And then in bounce bus, I set the input to that. And then so I actually just record my stereo 2-channel final performance, the thing that I'm mixing down. I record it down to this track that I call bounce. And so again, every DAW is different, right? In Pro Tools, you could just set up your buses. I go to I/O setup and I go to bus. And then right here, these are all the buses that I have. And you could label them whatever you want to label them. And that's all they are. All they are is just digital routing systems. Question number 7, what is your process of editing a vocal to make it sound good? How can I make a vocal have a 70s vibe versus a 90s pop vibe, etc.? So vocals are challenging to get to sound good, especially from a home studio. A lot of times, the problem that you will run into with recording vocals from home is the fact that the room that you're going to record the vocals in just sounds like garbage to record vocals in. Like, for instance, the room that I'm in right now is absolutely terrible to record vocals in. I got a brick wall back here. You can't see it, but like the ceilings are at a weird angle. Sound bounces all over the place here. It's really not a great room to get a good sounding vocal performance. That's why when you go to studios, you'll notice that the vocal, they usually have a booth for the vocal. It's like a small little closet room that's like very dead sounding and very dry. And that can get you a clearer, more upfront vocal. So the hardest part about recording vocals at home is the fact that most people don't have a good space to do it. But you can get around it with a couple different processing things. So I'll give you a short and long answer to this question because the longer answer, like how do you get a good vocal? It's such a hard question to answer because it depends on what the style of music is. It depends on what kind of microphone you have. It depends on what kind of singer you have. It depends on what kind of plugins you have, right? There's no one way to do anything, but I'll give you a short and long answer. So the short answer I would highly recommend checking out this plugin called Easy Mix 2. It's made by a company called TuneTrack. And if you check out Easy Mix 2 and then check out some of their expansion preset packs, they have one called Lead Vocals and Lead Vocals 2, and there's a couple of other different Vocal Toolbox, Songwriter's Toolbox, a couple different things. And what's cool about Easy Mix is they have presets. Like right now I'm using a preset that's called Crisp Room. And so they have all different types of things that create a processed sound that's based off of things that have been used in recordings before. So compressed pop vocals, crappy TV, crooked delay, and I believe, 70s rock, 50s rock. So if you go to some of these, it drastically changes the sound to match more of a vibe. And the longer answer to that question is then to just study recordings and audio engineers and mixers and find out how they achieved the sounds that they've achieved, and then try to find plugins and gear that matches that sound. You're never going to get exact, so just know that if you're ever trying to recreate the sound of something that you've heard, the chances of you being able to recreate it to where it sounds exact are slim to none. Okay, try it anyway, because that is how you learn. How you learn what your gear does and how you learn to make sounds is to take something that you like, figure out how it's created, and then experiment with trying to recreate it. Once again, you'll probably fail 99 times out of 100, maybe even 100 times out of 100. But the experience that you gain with learning how to use your gear, learning how to use your ear and go, okay, if I'm looking for this sound, I need this thing, and this thing. It's all part of the process. So the longer answer is just study what other people have done and try to recreate what they did and what they used to the best of your ability. Question number 8, how do you add a limiter? Okay, well, how you add it is pretty easy. In any DAW, you just go over to your plugins, you find limiter, and you add it to a track. But I don't think that is really the question he's asking. I feel like it's more of like, what is a limiter, and when and where and why would you use one? So a limiter is a type of compressor, and where it's usually used, it's to either control the dynamic range of either an individual instrument or of an entire mix or of a bus, right? So I started talking, and then I realized it's just a lot easier if I pull up the limiter I have in Pro Tools and show you what it does. I just had to put my headphones on in order to make sure that I could hear the changes. So this is a limiter that I have currently on the vocal that you're hearing. If I turn it off, it doesn't really make a huge difference in sound. It's maybe a little bit quieter, but it's not really drastic. So what I use a limiter for, I use it in a couple of different applications, and sometimes just specific limiters have a type of sound to it as a sound quality that's desirable. But where I use limiters the most, I definitely use them on vocals, and I use them on my 2-mix bus. You see, I have one down here on my 2-mix, and where I really use it at is just to make sure that I'm not clipping, right? So I'll set my limiter to be like minus 0.5 dB. That means that any kind of signal, this is where I have my ceiling at. As you see, if I move the ceiling, it moves this little arrow. And so how I set it up is like I want just a little bit of leeway, so I set it about a half a dB, and that means that no matter what happens, this signal will never go over this. I could add all the processing in the world to it, but once it creeps up to over minus 0.6 dB, okay, it won't. The limiter will not allow it to happen, okay? But where I really use it is to bring the overall volume up of something where because especially with a vocal is going to have spots where it's quiet and it's really low and it's intimate. And then it's going to have spots where it's really loud, right? And if you can hear through all this processing that I have on, the overall volume of what I just did sounded kind of consistent. And so what I do is you just adjust the threshold. You see, the more I adjust the threshold, the louder everything is getting, right? Everything is now really, really loud. If I talk really quiet, you can still hear everything really loud. If I talk really quiet now, it's not as loud. Okay, it's not as loud now. But if I turn this up now, you see that it's really loud. So I'm increasing the volume. But now here, if I do this, see, now you see the limiter starts kicking on. It starts adding some compression. So that means anything over this certain point in time. Once I get over a certain limit, it starts bringing the noise down. It starts compressing it down, okay? And so you have to be careful with the limiter, because if you go over that, that threshold a lot, it's going to make something sound really squished. So the problem that I ran into a lot of times is that you get things that are clipping. And so you add a limiter to it and you try to use the limiter to stop clipping. But what the limiter starts doing is just compressing everything, and everything sounds squished and terrible. So my advice to you, Jack, is I would definitely use a limiter when you're recording vocals. Definitely when you're recording vocals. Set it up so that it's not printing the effect to the recorded performance, but so that you can hear it, because then you can adjust your overall volume of your vocals without trying to turn up your headphone amp or whatever, because your vocals are going to sound really inconsistent. And so having some sort of compression and limiting on it is going to make it just be more even, okay? But where to watch out for it is adding limiting to your master bus, right? If I go here to the limiter of my master bus, it's just touching it. Like I have just a little bit of limiting on my master bus at all times. It's just to catch the very big peaks, to make sure that it doesn't get into that distorted territory. But if you try to make everything just really loud, or you add a limiter to everything, it will end up ruining stuff more than it ends up helping stuff. And the last question, number 9, how do I know which reverb to add? Do I add reverb on everything? Well, definitely don't add reverb on everything. Don't add reverb for the sake of reverb. So reverb exists to create the illusion of space. And there's different types of reverbs. There's room reverbs that recreate the sound of specific types of rooms or sizes of rooms. There's hall reverbs, which mimic the sounds of like concert halls. And then there's plate reverbs and all sorts of types of reverbs. So knowing which one sounds good on which particular instrument for which particular song, there's no answer to that. It's just a matter of personal taste, right? Trying out stuff, seeing what you like, and seeing what sounds the best. Here's how I like to use reverb. So either I'm going to apply reverb to the individual track, and that's usually in a circumstance where the reverb is important to the vibe of the track. So if I'm like recording like a U2 type guitar part, right? It's got delay and it's got heavy effects. I'll put reverb on that guitar track because I want that track to have a specific type of vibe. But if you add reverb, and if you add a different reverb to every single instrument in your mix, it is going to sound terrible, because all of those reverbs are going to compete with each other. Not to mention, reverbs take up a lot of computer processing power. So if you have an older computer, or don't have a lot, a high CPU or a lot of RAM, sometimes adding in, more than 3 or 4 reverbs just completely bogs down your system, and you can't do anything. So it sounds bad, and it's probably going to be inefficient in terms of workflow. But if I could come back to Pro Tools here, I'll kind of show you one of the ways that I like to use reverb. So I'll do this with either individual groups of tracks, so like the drum track, or all the vocals, or all of the guitars. So sometimes I'll do like more group processing with reverb as opposed to putting on an individual channel, or I'll just do a global reverb, that there's one reverb for every instrument in the song, and I feed all of the instruments into that reverb. And so how I do that, going back to an earlier question, is I use buses. So I have a reverb track here that's got a couple different reverbs on it that I turn on and off, and I have the input set to it as reverb 1, okay? So the input to this track is reverb 1, and it's got my reverb plugins on it. And the output of this track is going to my 2 mix, which is my, kind of my main out, right? And so what I would do is, on the tracks that I want to add reverb on, put the plugin on the track, I go and I create a send, right? And all a send is, it's an access to a bus. So on the send, I'm just saying, send a copy of this signal to reverb 1, right? There's the send to reverb 1. It's inactive right now, but this goes to that. So I could open this up and I can adjust how much level I'm sending to the reverb to begin with, right? Because that's another thing too with reverb is, you don't want to always over drench it, right? You just want sometimes reverb to be a little subtle, and you want a mix of the dry sound with the wet sound of the reverb. And how you could achieve that is by sending a copy of the signal to a reverb track. So this gives me like more control over how much reverb I want. So this is how I tend to add reverb on most of my things. I like to use buses. So on a vocal, I'll create a send to a reverb track, and I'll just blend in how much reverb that I want. And again, sometimes I'll do that. I could have sometimes maybe 2 or 3 different types of reverbs on a song, maybe sometimes 4. Sometimes I just have one, and I'm feeding everything into it. Like that is good. I'll do that. Like, if I want to really capture a natural live performance that sounds like everybody's in the same room, because oftentimes when I'm recording, I'm not in the same room with the people that I'm playing with. I'm recording in Texas, somebody's recording drums in Pennsylvania, somebody's recording bass in California. And so I have to try to make it sound like, hey, we all did this at the same time. And a way to kind of fake that is I'll create a room reverb, a very subtle room reverb, and I'll send the drums, the bass, and the guitar into it so that it sounds like that they're occupying the same space. All right, so that was pretty long-winded, and I felt like I rambled a little bit there. So if there's anything that didn't make any sense whatsoever, please let me know in the comment section. And if it spawned new questions, again, feel free to ask, and I'll do another one of these videos in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.